virtually. This is the temporary structure for the Senate while Parliament is being reconstructed on the Hill. And this is a lovely transformation of the old railway station. Before we start, please note that the event today is being translated in both official languages. By clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, participants can choose the language they would prefer to hear throughout the event. If, however, participants wish to hear the original floor audio, they may leave the set turned off. For those of you in the Senate chamber, you have the usual translation device in front of you.
By clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen, participants can choose the language they would prefer to hear throughout the event. If, however, participants wish to hear the original floor audio, they may leave this setting turned off.
The event is being broadcast by CPAC, and more than 600 individuals have registered to participate online. Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. My name is Peter Harder, and on behalf of the Senate Action Group on Prosperity, I'd like to welcome you to this chamber. We've invited you here today, and those online, to discuss the need for a new vision of Canada's economic future and the ideas put forward in the Senate's Prosperity Group report, which was released last week. The report is entitled Rising to the Challenge of New Global Realities, Forging a New Path for Sustainable, Inclusive, and Shared Prosperity in Canada. More about that in a moment, but let me introduce to you the senators participating in this group. They are Senators Diane Bellemare of Quebec, Peter Beam of Ontario, Brent Cotter of Saskatchewan, Colin Deacon of Nova Scotia, Tony Dean of Ontario, Percy Down of Prince Edward Island, Marty Klein of Saskatchewan, Elizabeth Marshall of Newfoundland and Labrador, and Sabi Marwa of Ontario, Paul Massicot of Quebec, and Pierrette Ringette of New Brunswick. Today's event will be split into two parts. The first will be a panel discussion among several eminent Canadians that will take us to about 2:40. The second will begin at 3 o'clock and will take the form of a fireside chat without the benefit of fire, led by the Public Policy Forum President Ed Greenspan, whose organization is co-sponsoring this event with us. That discussion will include two very special guests, former Prime Minister Joe Clark and former British Columbia Premier Christy Clark. There will be a short break in between the two sessions. I'd like to now invite Senator Ringette, as the Deputy Speaker of the previous Parliament, to welcome us on behalf of the Speaker who was unable to attend today. Senators.
Senator. Mr. Clark, Mr. Manley, Ms. Clark, Honourable Senators, Chief Bellegarde, Elder Oakes, Mr. Greenspan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our distinguished speaker, the Honourable George Furey, we are honoured to welcome you to this important event, whether you are participating in person or joining us virtually. We are also happy to co-sponsor this event with the Public Policy Forum and its CEO, Edward Greenspan. Thank you for supporting this desired conversation starting in our chamber today. Senators, in the sober second thought process, do reach out to all Canadians for greater perspectives, thus enriching the debate. I want to thank the 12 senators of the Senate Prosperity Action Group for their work, their report, and their invitation to this important conversation. 2 years ago, the notion of rebuilding the Canadian economy would not have been a likely topic of conversation. After all, Canada was the 9th largest economy in the world in 2020, and it had recently withstood the impacts of the 2008 global financial crisis. When the COVID-19 pandemic first hit, not only did it have serious and devastating impacts on the health and livelihoods of Canadians, but it also pushed the Canadian and global economies into their deepest recessions since the Great Depression. The initial responses to limit the spread of COVID-19, such as business and school closures, states of emergency, and physical distancing, had positive impacts on public health, but negative impacts on Canada's economic activity within our borders and in the global arena. The economic and social challenges facing Canada in the aftermath of the pandemic was what catalyzed the 12 senators of the Prosperity Action Group last fall, who sought to examine these issues and determine how best to deal with them. We would not be discussing these issues today in this chamber if not for their report entitled Rising to the Challenge of New Global Realities. We are thankful for their contribution. What we know today is that the impact of the pandemic has been uneven, affecting certain segments of the economy and society more than others. Moreover, many of the challenges facing the Canadian economy existed pre-pandemic and were simply exacerbated during these challenging times. However, we are beginning to see signs of optimism as Canadians have expressed in conversations and actions their desire to reconcile with Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples, to embrace our multicultural citizenry, and to eliminate the social margins in which many Canadians live their lives. As Canada pivots towards recovery, Canadian legislators have an important role to play in deciding how to navigate the country, its social cohesiveness, and its economy into the future.
Of sober second thought, senators, including those comprising the Prosperity Action Group, will undoubtedly feel that there are essential questions that need to be asked at this important juncture. Questions such as, what do we want our economy to look like in the future? And what policies and action can we undertake now to make that vision a reality in the future? When and how will the Canadian economy create wealth to sustain our economy and social well-being? How do we manage the additional debt incurred during the crisis and rebuild Canada's fiscal sustainability? How can all Canadians work together to ensure that everybody benefits from a post-pandemic recovery? In these regards, the Prosperity Action Group's report constitutes an important contribution to the debate. Now is the time for us to tackle the tough issues facing the Canadian economy and to open doors to a better future. Failing to act now could have significant economic and social consequences for our future prosperity. We need a national economic vision that is dynamic, diverse, sustainable, and inclusive for all Canadians. Recognizing that the impacts of COVID-19 will have long-lasting and, in some cases, irreversible effects on the global and national economies. A number of international organizations, such as the UN and the OECD, have begun calling for economic recovery measures that would avoid a return to business as usual and instead steer countries toward policies that are more socially, environmentally, and economically conscious. As Canadians and global citizens, we have a unique opportunity. We can make choices for our economy and the future of our country. In rebuilding our economy, we can focus on key areas such as innovation, employment and economic growth, climate mitigation measures, inclusivity, and social cohesion. I want to thank all very much for your participation here today. I hope that the discussion we hold will stimulate greater conversation and dialogue and ultimately lead to solid policy and legislation that will steer Canada towards the dynamic, diverse, sustainable, and inclusive national economic vision we imagine. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senatress Ringette. Before we get to the panel, I would invite Elder Larry Oakes of the Nikanatian First Nation, who will deliver an opening prayer and comment, followed by Edmund Bellegarde, Tribal Chief of the File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council, both of whom will join us online and say a few words of relevance to Indigenous and Indigenous issues which this report sought to achieve. Elder Larry Oakes.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to thank Senator Klein for the presentation of the tobacco. And we'll recognize the tobacco for bringing us all together. And I'm very strengthened by the words of the Senate in the work that you're forging on ahead with. I'm going to be praying in Cree, but I'll ask in your hearts and minds to join in and ask for the request that's being made for help that we can recover from this terrible 2 years that we've been going through, and the country is back doing great things once again by all working together. I'm going to be praying to the pipes, that's the ones that are across the land in the many communities, the many tribes, the many elders. Those are the ones that are going to interpret what we're requesting in the spirit world. So with that, I'll ask you to help me out with a prayer. Mamo tao inan, tabagano nano tagap mamo tasimtoa, tasitoa. Ha tatante, kapto tumage, ha kapte kaskina, kap machiwa katoch. Ha mage tamage nek ha uspag nagewi, kagagis mutotogik. Ha nek skate mogtante kapto tachiki kapto tamagya. Magik tamagan nigan heb tamagyan ha new machiwan. Nato when ka kyo pagui te kap moten geo ni chai shinim nanik. Ha magik to spagan ha te tante kap the swate me. Ha gam kap the tamage. Ha magik ta ha kap steno nan ha te ka stak the scheme nanik tante maya. Ha tamaga mamu to skewen het ha gab mak mem to tamak shat shun kayu shun waku tuen. Ha magek ta kakyo et mia shikap mi go swag ni chen dai si ni nanik pugi te gap maya chiraskina. Ha tamag no nan kakyo. Oh. Hey. That's good. Yeah. Thank you for joining me in the prayer. And what I said in the prayer was that we're going to ask the pipes to interpret what we're requesting and to recognize all the different areas of Mother Earth and the different tribes and how they do their work, and also that we all get recognized that we're keeping Mother Earth clean through the way that we work in through relationship, through hard work, and through kindness. So with that, I wish everybody the best of the meeting and the best of the day, and also your future. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Oaks, for leading that prayer and for sharing and interpreting some of the relevance of what you've led this morning and this afternoon, depending on what part of Canada that everybody is joining from. Nia Okamau Keheowigwan. Mio Kisakansik. I am making my effort to try my best to introduce myself in my Cree language with my Cree name. And my Cree name, Ogamau Kehiwigwan, means King Eagle Feather or Chief Eagle Feather. I am Edmund Bellegarde, currently the Tribal Chief and CEO of Fowl Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council. I'm joining you from Treaty 4 territory and from the Treaty 4 Grounds Reserve in Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan. Want to just share a little bit of Elder Oaks' background. Not only is he a traditional knowledge keeper, a language keeper, he is the keeper of many of our traditional teachings that have been passed on for generations and generations. And he keeps that responsibility and that role at the forefront of his conduct and how he conducts himself, but how he interacts with everything in our universe, including people. Mm-hmm. Larry has been the chief of Niigaaniit First Nation for many years. So he also understands the political challenges. He understands the economic and the social challenges that not only face First Nations people, but as the public and as a society in Canada. So just want to pay special acknowledgement to Larry and thank him for leading us today. I want to also acknowledge the Honorable Peter Harder, Senator Peter Harder, for stewarding this Senate committee and the important work, and the Honorable Senator Marty Klein for his invitation to have us participate from Treaty 4 territory today and to share. Forging a new path for sustainable, inclusive, and shared prosperity in Canada is important work, and many experts have been summoned by the Senate Committee of Canada to share their knowledge and provide their advice to charting a new course for Canada. We just finished the September 30th, the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a federal holiday to mark the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, but to also bring some of that truth forward of Canada's history. We have much to talk about. We have many, many dialogues to happen, not just in the halls of Parliament, in the Senate chambers, not just in the Saskatchewan legislature and other provincial and territorial governments, places of governance, but in our communities and in our homes. And it cannot be an interaction that is only with First Nations, the Inuit, or the Métis Nation. It has to be had amongst all Canadians, and we have to have that meaningful dialogue and discussion. Canada, it's time for a more inclusive country that recognizes and affirms First Nations as founding partners of Canada. Public policy is one of the main tenets and processes in which we achieve that. Public policy must be enriched moving forward with the value that First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation that bring forward in their worldviews and in our traditional ancestral knowledge that we share. As Indigenous peoples of this land, we have a special connection to Mother Earth, to our land, to our bases. There cannot be always a pan-Canadian approach because it differs, because the land and Mother Earth differs from territory to territory as we go across the land. And there are different traditions and there's different connections and different relationships. Let me say that the work of our treaty partners, Treaty number 4 was entered into September 15, 1874. And one of the main principles that our oral history and our treaty ancestors teach us and ask us to carry on, they tell us of our sacred covenants and our obligation. Elder Oaks shared with you the prominence and the role of our pipes in this process. It is through that sacred connection and that sacred covenant that we must have good relations. We must carry on that treaty relationship with the Crown and Right of Canada. We must carry on that nation to nation. So we need the intent to be inclusive of all people who walk on Canada's lands, all people who walk the traditional territories of the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit peoples. So with that, we need to have meaningful engagement. We need to recognize and value not only the economic, but also the social and political context in which Indigenous peoples will bring and add value to Canada's policy to ensure that it is inclusive, but not to have this one-way streets of policy and that historic approach, but to make it more inclusive and to recognize that as Indigenous people, we have value to add to help strengthen Canada as a country, to help strengthen Canada's economic prosperity, but to share more meaningfully in all of that. So we as Indigenous people have that value to offer and to bring to this table to add to the strength of all of Canada. Thank you, Senators and the Senate Committee and the experts on the panel that are coming together for this very important work. And thank you for the inclusive aspects in which Senator Klein has brought forward this part of the morning and the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder Oaks and Chief Bellegarde. Canada and Canadians have suffered a good deal over the past 18 months as we work to tackle the corona pandemic. Those sacrifices, we hope, will allow us to return to some sort of new normal over the coming months. However, many headwinds still face our nation, and maintaining Canada's traditional prosperity is another challenge we must work together to overcome. Almost a year ago, 12 senators from across the chamber got together to look at these issues. The result is our report, which was released last week. During our work, we held 44 meetings, all virtual, and we heard from over 70 witnesses who gave much of their time to inform us on these subjects. While we tried to be thorough in articulating the challenges we face, there are undoubtedly areas where we are not as comprehensive as we would have wished and as some observers would have suggested. Our hope is that today's discussion will help foster further conversation over how Canada can emerge from the pandemic on a solid and prosperous footing that will benefit us all. Time allowing, we would also like to hear from our audience members. I'm now speaking particularly to those who are virtually attending. If you have a question during today's discussion, please don't hesitate to send us that question or comment via the chat line. We'll be taking a few questions at the end of each session, and indeed compiling all of the questions as the record of this day. I'd now like to introduce our first panelists for the first portion of this event. My co-host in our first panel is Monique Leroux. Monique is currently the chair of the Industry Strategy Council, which issued its own report, Restart, Recover, and Reimagine Prosperity for All Canadians, just under a year ago. She is the former chair and CEO of the Desjardins Group and is deeply involved in issues analyzing economic and social well-being in Canada. Joining us on the panel is John Manley, former Deputy Prime Minister, former CEO of the Business Council, and current Chair of the Board of CIBC, and yes, one of my ministers when I was a Deputy Minister.
Most important.
We also have Tabitha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and Chris Reagan, the Director of the McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. And in attending virtually from Montreal, we have Francis Donald, Chief Economist at Manulife Financial and a much sought-after communicator on global economic conditions. Monique, I'm going to start with you to reflect on how this report builds on the Strategy Council report of a year ago, for which you gave such outstanding leadership. Where you think this report builds on that? Where are some of the gaps? And how would you assess the work that the Senate has done?
Permettez-moi tout d'abord, Monsieur le
Allow me, first of all, Senator, to thank you and all senators for your invitation today. It's a great privilege for me to be here with you. And I would like to salute the other conference presenters and those who have joined us virtually today. It's a significant question that you're asking. I'll start by saying that your report is, in my opinion, excellent and very inspiring. I would say that the report on which we worked, and I thank the members of the Industry Strategy Council, some of whom are connected today, for their work. We started our work in June 2020 in a context that was quite different. We were in an emergency situation. There was a lot of volatility and uncertainty, and I believe that our first work was very focused on short-term goals, which I think were very useful for the government, since a number of the short-term recommendations that we made were essentially retained. Then we worked on a more medium-term components, and a number of our recommendations were also incorporated into Budget 2020. Furthermore, there's a longer term scope, and that is where our work joins yours. This talks about prosperity and reimagining prosperity in Canada.
I could say that there is a lot of convergence and alignment in the thinking process. We came with this approach in the report related to how we can reimagine prosperity for all Canadians. We're talking about an industrial policy or an industrial strategy. And at the end of the day, in the report of your group, you are talking about a national growth strategy. I would say that your approach is probably much more global and inclusive. Maybe we were a little bit too narrow in the way we were looking at it, but conceptually it was a little bit the same thing, because we talk about this notion of an industrial policy or strategy with an important investment growth plan supported by two important elements, which were, on one side, to talk about a renewed partnership between the public sector and the private sector, and building on a rigorous fiscal framework. So it is interesting to see in your own report how those concepts are, in my view, so well expressed, because you are talking about a national growth strategy, you are talking about fiscal resilience, and you are talking about a Grande Alliance, or this notion of prosperity council, that I think personally very powerful, because I don't think at this point in time that governments alone can be successful. You are talking about prosperity, and if I may, Senator, and I said that to you, prosperity in my mind is a very powerful word, because it is about wealth, but it is about well-being. It is about collective success. And we are at the Senate today, and as a former chair of the board and CEO of Desjardins, And you may know that Alphonse Desjardins was the secretary at the House of Commons. And in his vision for the creation of Desjardins Group, 1900, he talked about fundamentally how it was possible to bring to Canada sustainable prosperity. So prosperity, sustainable prosperity, is not a new concept, but it is very powerful. And I have to say, congratulations for bringing that back and bring, a report that is very inspirational. It's not a technical report. It's much more about providing a vision, providing a long-term perspective on what we can achieve together. And personally, I hope that the debates that we'll be having today will be contributive to coming out with a solid action plan. Donc, toutes mes félicitations.
So, well, my congratulations, Senator, and your group. Thank you.
Donald, who's joining us virtually, for her comments and observations of the last report.
Well, first, thank you very much, Senator, for including me in this discussion. It is a privilege, and I often learn more than I give in these events, beginning with Chief Belgrade's powerful opening comments and Elder Oak's prayer. Deuxièmement, toutes mes félicitations.
Secondly, all my congratulations to the senator for the new role, and I'm happy for him. And he has a great reputation in the economics world.
Of overview of Canada's growth challenge, and I particularly enjoy its focus on the longer term, which is where policy does need to be geared. So I find it somewhat challenging to provide value add on something so comprehensive. But I will make 3 supplementary points to this core work in items that I've observed in the last 6 months or so that are new but growing in importance, and perhaps are elements that we could add on as secondary or tertiary discussion points. First, global supply chain disruptions and other supply-side shocks are having a very serious impact on our global and Canadian economies. And while in the beginning it was believed that they would be short-term in nature and not an element that perhaps merited long-term discussion, it's now becoming clearer that these supply chain issues will be the 2022 and particularly 2023 type of challenges we need to observe. And in addition to major port closures in China, we have these additional shocks on our global economies, from droughts that are lifting food prices to global labor shortages. And while I'm sure we've all been sufficiently frustrated at seeing empty shelves in stores, or perhaps you're on a wait list for a fence like I am, or delayed Amazon shipping deliveries, these are surface level frustrations, and these supply chain disruptions should be viewed through a more serious, urgent lens. We are accustomed to viewing higher prices through the inflation lens, but they do risk hurting demand and the growth of our country. If your roast at Costco costs $70, you either choose not to buy that roast or you spend less in other areas of your life. In some cases, you have no choice but to make a purchase at a higher price. For example, energy prices are now skyrocketing. Natural gas costs you more to fill your gas tank to get to work. And challengingly, this is going to hit lowest of income Canadians hardest. They are the ones in which they're going to see their costs rises and their wages not increase that match. They're less likely to benefit from the wealth effects of higher home prices in a stock market. This issue needs to be viewed as somewhat urgent, but likely to persist longer than we had expected. It's also very challenging for higher interest rates to address inflation that is coming from port closures in China or droughts in Brazil. The Bank of Canada can raise interest rates all at once. Unfortunately, that will not solve that problem. We have very limited experience with supply-side shocks of this nature, both as economists, but also as Canadians. So I hope that as we build out some of our longer-term plans, we can remain cognizant of this nearer-term but very important challenge that may railroad us a little bit from focusing on some of these longer-term developments. And particularly, I want to emphasize how much this will disproportionately impact our most vulnerable Canadians. Second, the Prosperity Action Group and many of us in this virtual and literal room understand the absolute need to reinvigorate the business environment in Canada. We know we have challenges well articulated in this report, how much we have too much red tape by any metric. Our tax code is not as competitive as it could be. We should be focusing on diversifying global trade. We know these things. But one issue I think we are missing is just how important addressing the housing crisis is for our corporate health, in addition to, of course, many other areas. Very taboo for Bay Street economists to call the housing market a bubble, despite the fact that by every possible definition it is. And many pockets of Canada are certainly experiencing that. Bubbles come with many concerns that are already well articulated in this argument. In this environment, the economy's dependence on housing. Real estate is 13% of this economy. Energy is less than 6%, and yet we focus on one much more than the other. So the risk of lower prices, we talk about what the housing market crash might do to the financial system. We talk about what it would do to everyone's individual income, but even then we've been too myopic on what the housing affordability crisis will do to Canada. And one element of it that really keeps me up at night is how the housing affordability crisis is going to make it very difficult, in addition to many other issues, to attract and retain labor in Canada. One of Canada's few competitive advantages has been our effectively cheap labor relative to Canada quality. I will tell you that I cost much less than a New York City economist, and I'm probably about 90% as good. So there's a ratio there that's explained. But we're going to struggle to entice the best in the world to live in some of the most expensive cities in the world when they're not being sufficiently paid for it. And the bleed through from housing to our broader ability to innovate, grow, expand, that's getting much worse. And this is an urgent challenge. Third, and some of you might know, I live on the dark side of Canadian economists. I work as a financial economist, which is why it's so good that you have counterparted me on this panel with those who do much better things for Canadians. I use economics to make decisions in financial markets and not to help people as much as I often would like. But lately there has been a nexus in my world between recognizing a financial opportunity with what is best for Canadians, and that is in an area called green bonds. There are a lot of good ideas in this report about what we must do to help Canadians in their prosperity, but the answers usually come back to how. Do we raise taxes? Do we cut costs in other areas? How do we remain fiscally responsible? And I wanted to flag an area that I feel is often very overlooked and underappreciated, and that's the insatiable global thirst from the investment community for funding countries with green agendas with green bonds. Green bonds, if you're not familiar, are a specific type of government bond in which the proceeds are used exclusively to fund a project with environmental or climate benefits and increasingly social benefits as well. So you can raise these funds for green infrastructure, climate change adaptation, mitigation projects, and green bonds provide investors with an opportunity to support the transition to environmentally sound, low-carbon economies. And what's fantastic about these tools is that they're usually longer duration. You have much longer time to pay them back, and there's so much demand for them globally, you even get to pay a lower interest rate. In Germany, the green bonds interest rate is 0.5% lower than a regular old-fashioned bond. We call that a greenium. I hope it catches on. And I speak about this because I think we often underestimate how much thirst there is among global markets to lend money to countries like ours that want to invest in green. 45% of institutional investors plan to raise their exposure to green and sustainable bonds because of the pandemic and a new demand from clients. European countries cannot issue green bonds fast enough. Germany, Italy, Spain, UK offer green bonds, and when they do, they're anywhere from 5 to 12 times oversubscribed, meaning there's 5 to 12 times more demand than they're supplying. Now, Canada has done some work in this area. The 2021 federal budget plans to issue about 2% of total issuance in green bonds. Ontario has had some action. But I want to stress that there is a very strong global demand to invest in countries like ours that want to make these transitions, and Canada can and needs to be on top of this development. So while this is one example, I use it to say we have ambitious goals about what to improve in Canada that I think are well fleshed out. It's time that we be equally ambitious and creative with our how. Thank you for the opportunity for these comments. I really look forward to hearing the rest of the panel.
Thanks very much, Frances Donald. Now let me ask Chris Reagan to comment from his perspective.
Let me just take this off for a second. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with everybody else. And it's very nice to be out of my COVID cave and to actually see humans in the flesh. I'd like to begin by applauding the Prosperity Action Group for its work. There are many, many good ideas in this report. And frankly, I think they all deserve to be discussed more and debated more. And so hopefully this will be the beginning of that. So this report is about growth and sustainability and inclusion. And I really appreciated Monique's comments about the power of the word prosperity, because prosperity really is, while it's probably difficult to define with any precision, it really is about all of those things. So there's so many issues and cross-cutting. What I want to do in my few minutes is to give a fiscal frame for my observations. And I suppose the organizing theme is things that I think are important and that aren't being talked about enough in this country. This is not a claim that they're not being talked enough about in the report, but in the country. Now, of course, the pandemic has had many, many effects on Canada, the Canadian economy, and on Canadians. And we all know about the enormous rise in public deficits and public debt that have taken place just in the past 18 months. And that's really my beginning observation. So I'd like to make 4 points from that. If you look at the combined federal-provincial debt-to-GDP ratio, it is now almost as high. It's only a few percentage points less than where it was in the early 1990s. At that time, many of you will remember, when we thought that we had hit the debt wall. Some of you will say we did hit the debt wall, but we certainly believed, or many people believed, that we hit a debt wall. And so to me, that is raising a red flag. Now, one response to this is that interest rates today are far lower than they were then, and that is indeed correct. So 10-year government bonds today are about 1.5%. Back in the early 1990s, they would have been several percentage points higher. The problem is it's easy to be complacent about low interest rates today because interest rates are a market price, and a market price that can rise very quickly. We could very easily have a 100 basis point increase in bonds in a year, or frankly, even in 3 months. All it requires is for the world's lenders, to wake up one day and realize that because the advanced economies have all been borrowing huge amounts over the past 2 years, then maybe, in fact, there will be a reckoning at some point. So what in the report is named the Dodge proposal, that's not dodging away from something, that's the David Dodge proposal, of limiting debt service to 10% of GDP is something worth thinking about. And if you did actually limit the debt service payments as a share of GDP, that actually, I mean, if you take that seriously, you really have to think very carefully about where your debt is going. Because if interest rates rise by 100 basis points in a year or 200 basis points in 4 years, that starts to force fairly sudden adjustments in terms of the quantity of debt. My second point is that all of the last 18 months of increases in public deficit and public debt has happened on top of a fiscal problem that we already had and we're not talking about enough. And that is the fiscal and demographic problem that comes from the aging of the population. And that is happening in many, many countries, not just Canada. But if you look at the rising healthcare costs, which of course are mostly provincial, and the rising elderly-related costs like OAS and GIS, which is federal, healthcare costs, of course, are the single largest item in provincial budgets, and they are the fastest growing. And the OAS GIS costs at the federal budget are the largest single federal budget item, and also rather quickly growing. Those two things combined are scheduled is not quite the right word, forecasted to grow by roughly 4 percentage points of GDP between a couple of years ago and 2040. So that's 20 years now, and that's 4 percentage points of GDP. Now, this is a return of what we used to call the fiscal imbalance, where the books of the federal government are in better shape than the books of the provincial governments. But of course, after the last 18 months, everything is looking a lot worse than it was before. 4 percentage points of GDP does not put us to where Greece was in 2011. I don't want to suggest that the sky is falling, but it's large enough that it suggests that we need to think about it. So the first 2 points add them together and bring me to my third point, which is, in my view, there is a real need to rethink government's fiscal priorities. I think it's true at the federal level, and I think it is true at the provincial level. If we didn't know already 18 months ago that government can't do everything, we should know 18 months later that government can't do everything. So you can't spend on everything. You can't push taxes up forever, and maybe you can't even push some taxes up higher than they are now. And you can't push debt up indefinitely. So I would say that, to me, this is a very good time. And frankly, I did make this argument, and I could have made this argument 2 years ago, but certainly we can make this argument more easily today, that it's a very good time for something like what we did in the early to mid-1990s when we embarked on program review, when the federal government was involved in its fiscal consolidation. But I would like to suggest that it's more than a program review. I want to suggest a three-part review, and this is my fourth point. I think we should be doing a spending review, and here we get to the Dalby rule, the Bev-Dalby rule, that perhaps we should put a cap on actual program spending as a share of GDP. Now, number one, you can debate whether there should be a cap, and number two, you can debate what level that cap would be at. But at least to have that conversation, I think actually would be very reasonable. But I would also suggest that even if you put a spending cap, that's not sufficient. I would argue that what we really need to do in a spending review is actually review our spending programs and eliminate or reduce spending on low priority items, and that makes room for higher priority items. Now, of course, that forces you to think through what is a low priority item. What is government actually not needed for? And let's do less of that so that we can make room for the things that government really is needed for. So this is not an argument for reducing the size of government. It's an argument for making sure that we are spending the taxpayers' money on the things that we really, really do need government for. What I'm suggesting sounds great. Well, maybe it doesn't sound great to all of you. It sounds great to me. And it may sound easy on paper, but John Manley will be the first to tell you that it is politically not easy. The second part of my everything review, not quite everything review, would be a regulatory review. This is a deeply unsexy thing to talk about. It's talked about a little bit in the report. What I would suggest is not that we pitch this as a blue ribbon commission to cut red tape, because the suggestion there is that you're just trying to hack and slash at regulations. There's lots of good regulations that are needed in the Canadian economy. But I think what we should do is look through our many, many regulations in all sectors of the economy and look for ones that are obstacles to growth. And I would actually use that as the framing dice. Look for things that are obstacles to growth. Look for those regulations that are preventing competition. There's a lot of evidence from many years and many countries to suggest that in sectors where you have the most competition, those are the sectors where you have the highest productivity growth. So look for regulations that are preventing competition. And unless those regulations are doing something else very useful, like a very useful social service or environmental service, then get rid of those regulations. Regulations which are no longer required. Some regulations might have been perfectly sensible 25 years ago and are no longer sensible because the market environment has changed or the world has changed. How about regulations which don't actually achieve their objectives? Perhaps they never did. Of course, once regulations get put on the books, it's very difficult to take them off the books. But I actually think, and as I say, this is a deeply unsexy thing to recommend, but you can set up your unsexy commission on regulatory reform to actually go through and do a serious review. And the final part of my almost everything review would be a taxation review. It has been about 35 years since the federal tax system was reformed. And over time, I think perhaps there's a general theorem about democratic politics and tax systems, that the tax systems simply get cluttered with with new policies. We all know that there are many tax expenditures on the books. Many of them are boutique tax credits. You've heard that term. I would argue that there's far too many of those. And I think an effort to actually clean those out in a large scale would go a long way. I think there's not enough focus, and there was a little bit more in this report, and that's good, not enough focus on the GST. And I think if there is a need for more tax revenues in the future, I think we want to be thinking about GST tax increases rather than relying on personal income tax or corporate income tax, especially if you then think about the disincentive effects on growth that you get from high PIT and CIT rates. I know that that is also unpopular. It's probably the case that the GST is the most unpopular tax in Canadian history, but it is actually a very good tax. So let me end there. Those are my 4 big comments in my fiscal frame. There's, of course, many other things to talk about in this report. I have a feeling that sustainability is going to come up in the questions and on which I have a little to say. So I'll just leave that for then.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you.
That's a very courageous list. I think that's what the deputies say to a minister. Tabitha Bull.
Ani Tabitha Indigenakas, Nipissing Indigenaba, Midgesi Dodem. Hello, it's very an honor to be here. So I have just said my name in Anishinaabe. I am a member of Nipissing First Nation, and our clan is the Eagle. I want to say a huge thank you to Miigwech to Elder Oaks for his opening prayer and for his teaching about the pipes of the Cree Nation, and to Chief Bellegarde for his remarks. I also want to say a Miigwech to Senator Klein for bringing myself and other Indigenous leaders to be able to participate in this work with the Prosperity Action Group, and to Senator Herter for having me here today. You know, last week a number of people in this country took a moment to reflect on Truth and Reconciliation Day. We're all on this journey of truth and reconciliation, and for many of us, we're further along on this path than others. Canadians are really, some just beginning to learn and understand the extent of the damage that was caused by generations of oppression suffered by Indigenous people. And we all have a role to play to change the behavior and take the necessary steps to make our country whole. In 1867, through the Indian Act, Indigenous inherent economic rights were systematically and expressly stripped. Many Canadians do not know that from 1851 until as recently as 2014, although not enforced recently, the Indian Act contained a permit system to control First Nations' ability to sell products off the reserve. Until 1951, Indigenous peoples were not considered Indians under the Indian Act if they obtained a post-secondary school degree. If you became a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, you were no longer an Indian. That meant that we lost mentors and role models for our youth and the opportunity to generate intergenerational wealth. This has made way to generations of financial struggle and trauma. We must, as Canadians, work together to ensure all Canadians are dedicated to building respectful economic partnerships. It is a huge, immense responsibility for me to be here today. In part, the role of CCAB is to build relationships and partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses, helping to grow the economy, which means prosperity for Indigenous people and the whole country. And I want to focus on this word prosperity. I completely agree, as stated in the report, that recovery will not meet its potential without tackling pre-existing social and economic challenges. But we must go beyond closing the gaps. Definitely we cannot reach prosperity without clean drinking water for everyone, without infrastructure that's equitable across this country, without education opportunities that are equitable to all the youth across the country. But in order to build an inclusive economy that ensures Indigenous people are not only participants, but have the opportunity to determine our own outcomes. For too many years, we have been told where to go. We have been told the places we are to be, and we have told the path that we are to go forward on. However, Indigenous people have persisted. We are growing. We are creating Indigenous businesses at 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous Canadians. We are continuing to look for opportunities to export. We are building infrastructure projects in partnership with corporate Canada. We are economic powerhouses. And without Indigenous business, without Indigenous prosperity and an Indigenous economy, the Canadian economy will not be able to move forward. So I commend a number of places in this report where it speaks to inclusion, where it speaks to ensuring that Indigenous people and underrepresented people are part of this discussion. I look forward to working forward on the economic growth strategy and ensuring that there is an Indigenous-led perspective within that. We need to look at the benefit of incorporating Indigenous worldviews, as Chief Bellegarde said. Sustainability, looking forward at 7 generations, is the way that we have been brought up, and bringing that conversation forward into corporations, into infrastructure projects, is a benefit to Canada, a benefit to corporate Canada, and really a benefit to investment. External investors, investors in other countries are looking for project certainty, and with an Indigenous partner on an infrastructure project, your project has much more certainty than not. I want to think too about prosperity and Indigenous worldview. We need to ensure that we are able to get back the intergenerational wealth that was lost since contact. However, it's not just about money. It's about internal and external worlds being congruent. It's about giving generously, protecting and loving one another. It's about having healthy land and healthy water. And it's about self-determination. I think together as a country, we are making extreme strides, not just with me just being here in the Senate chamber today, but in the work last week, in the recognition of Canadians, and in many of the incredible strides that Indigenous businesses are making, which I'll speak to later. So I say Chi-miigwech to all of you for being here. I look forward to the work in the future.
Thank you so much. John Manley.
Thank you, Senator. And I heard your advice ringing in my ears about the courage of Chris's recommendations. My first deputy, who was not Peter, gave me a very sage piece of advice on day one, which was that I acquire a copy of the printed version of the British comedy series, Yes, Minister.
It's a documentary.
He assured me that it would stand me in good stead, and that, of course, is where you learn that if the deputy tells you that your decision is a courageous one, he's really telling you that you're about to drive off a cliff. And he will not be in the car with you. But thank you for inviting me. I did succeed in finding a YouTube video so that I could remember how to tie a tie for the first time in 19 months. It's really a pleasure, as Chris said, to be in public company again, although I'm slightly terrified, I have to admit. The report has offered us a huge landscape upon which we can comment and find things, and I'll follow the example of my colleagues and pick a few areas. In particular, I'd like to pick up with what have we learned from the pandemic? So I think personally I've learned a few things that I didn't intuitively know before. One is that we're really somewhat alone in the world. I guess I knew that somewhat, that countries don't have friends, they have interests, and if you want a friend in the world, you should get a dog. But when President Trump moved to stop the export of PPE to Canada, that was the 2x4 over the head that should tell us that in this world, countries are actually going to put their own domestic interest first. And regrettably, that means that we've had some real impacts, as Francis was saying, on supply chains. We've had some disruption in availability of some key supplies. I haven't been waiting for a fence. However, I did attempt to build a garage, and you treat those scraps of plywood like they're made of gold, because in fact they are made of gold. Slightly declining at the moment, but they're still pretty valuable pieces. It made me think that a strategy as Monique's group outlined a strategy, perhaps needs to turn its back on what we've believed for 30 years, which is a very global strategy where we rely on comparative advantage. It's really good economics. And look as well at what are some things that Canada must be able to provide its people, even if sustaining their production is going to be more expensive than would otherwise be the case. Now, I happen to know that my mask came from a plant in Burnaby, which is kind of unusual because most of these disposable masks that you see kicking around on the streets came from, you named it, China. Don't we think we ought to find some certainty of supply? Okay, that was one thing I learned. Another thing I learned when I was working for Peter as his minister was just how limited government can be at actually delivering on executing on a strategy. We do reward, I think, in the public service and in politics, people who think deep thoughts about strategy, about policy, about high-level things. We don't reward the people who actually implement them down at the local level. And therefore, this notion of partnership, first, Monique has talked about between government and business, but also with all of the other actors in the economy becomes really crucial. Canadian government did try to develop a vaccine. It was a failure. Who developed the vaccines? The private sector. None of it was done in Canada. Quite frankly, we haven't run a policy that was friendly to pharmaceutical research and development in Canada for many years. It's not surprising that much of the research is done elsewhere. We've run a policy, for very good public policy reasons, that advocated for cheap drugs. Well, you can get cheap drugs, but don't expect that you're going to attract investment. Then when you do need the products, you've got to go elsewhere to get them. But they came from the private sector. And we could repeat that through. Many of us really survived certainly I did, the last 19 months on virtual contacts. I've used every platform, from Zoom to WebEx to Google Teams to, even Blue Jeans, believe it or not, as a platform. I think I've used them all. You know what? They weren't running on government lines. They were running on lines that were built, quite frankly, by the telecommunications sector. A few months ago, some of you may have noticed, the Government of Canada ran an auction for spectrum for 5G development. Government of Canada took $9 billion out of the telecommunications industry. What's it going to spend that money on? All the things government spends its money on. Did anyone think, maybe first of all, that's way more when you calculate it by unit of people that are going to actually get the service, way more than anybody else pays. Did anyone think maybe we should be trying to mitigate the cost of the spectrum in order to enable, through very smart regulation, the investment in getting these networks built? Because if we're going to win that race that your panel wrote about, Peter, to the fourth industrial revolution, we're going to need those networks. And global experience suggests they're not going to be very well built by government if governments try to do it. So it's going to require a very smart partnership with the private sector. And it probably doesn't mean that you take that much capital out of the sector. Next thing I'd say is, sometimes, especially sitting, I was going to say over here at the Department of Finance, but it's a new building since my days, kind of think of, and you were in the building, Chris, kind of think of the economy like it's You know, the heartbeat is here at finance and at the Bank of Canada. You know, that's one of the things I've learned. That's just not true. That's just not true. What is the economy? The economy is the accumulation on a minute-by-minute basis of millions and millions of discrete decisions by the economic actors across the land. Yeah, they might be the CEO of CIBC, make some big decisions, but it's also the woman that goes into the food store to buy food for her family and can't buy that roast that is too expensive now and has to make a decision to defer it or buy something else or spend something else. Those decisions are what drive the economy. Some of them are big ones, some of them are micro ones. Day after day, unit by unit. What drives that? A lot of it is driven by confidence. At the micro level, confidence that the job I have today, I'm going to have tomorrow. Confidence that the paycheck I'm expecting next week, I'm actually going to get. At the investment level, it's confidence that the government is not going to change the rules, that it'll be transparent, predictable, and real. I'd say that business confidence is the cheapest form of economic stimulus. You can spray money at the economy with a fire hose, but you can't spray confidence with a fire hose. And if you don't have confidence, investment decisions are not going to be made. And one of the charts in your report should cause us all to reflect on this, because we can see that investment decisions were being made by Canadian-based businesses in favor of foreign investment over Canadian investment before the pandemic. What does that tell us? It tells us a few things, and it doesn't tell us, in my view, that these business leaders are somehow not patriotic. It's telling you very simply they think they can get a better return elsewhere, either for regulatory reasons, for taxation reasons, all of those things that go into making those investment decisions. Now, I guess the last thing I'd say, and it's sort of self-evident, but it bears repeating, it's way easier to redistribute wealth than it is to create it. But if you redistribute it without creating it, you got a really serious problem on your hands. And so what I would urge is, and there's lots in the report to drive toward this, that the prosperity needs to be built. We do not start with the assumption that we are already a prosperous country. According to some measures, we are relative to others. But there's a lot of gaps in that. But reallocation is not what will solve our problem. Growth is what's going to solve it. And Chris kindly mentioned the efforts that we made in the Chrétien government in the 90s to reduce the deficit, and it was a tough time. I mean, this was before Peter joined me. I was the industry minister. I lost half my budget. This was the largest reduction in federal government spending since demobilization after World War II. Like, it was big, and the politics were tough. I had a neighbor in my neighborhood in Ottawa South, I was a local MP, who got his layoff notice from my department. Well, I don't know, lots of different reasons why people go into politics. Generally, one of them is not so that your department can lay off your neighbors, especially one whose partner used to kind of look after our house when we were away and had the key and everything. It was an awkward moment, but we did some really hard things. It's politically difficult. But what really rescued us? And first of all, it was driven to some degree by force majeure. I mean, we were, David Dodge will clarify, but we were like within an hour of hitting the wall when Canadian bonds were not getting bid upon in the markets. That was before we thought the Bank of Canada could just buy all the bonds and print the money. But we were driven to make those tough decisions. What really solved the problem was growth. And what will solve the problem this time will be growth. We cannot cut our way to getting those fiscal numbers to work. We have got to find policies that are going to stimulate growth, and they've got to focus on investment and building the economy, not just on consumption and supporting incomes. However important that may be, it's not going to get us through to the promised land that the report hopes for.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you to all the panelists. Back to what you said, John, with a lot of experience, you're so right about the, I would say, comparative advantage of this country, and the fact that sometimes you need to think about how you can bring public policies all together into a comprehensive strategy to build an economy that is more competitive and resilient. So the example that you share were so right to the point. Now I would like to go to Francis for a first question, and I would like Francis to build, if I may, with what Chris was talking about. I would like to get your views about this notion of the Dodge proposal that we have in the report regarding limiting the debt service, and the other one, the Dalby proposal, limiting, providing a ceiling for, public expenditures. So I'd like to get your views about that, and maybe if you have the time to comment about this new geopolitics that we are facing. That was the opening remarks from John. Back to you.
Sure, thank you very much. So many elements of this. So certainly in favor of the Dodge proposal, because any fiscal anchor that is focused on interest rates is going to serve us far better than applying some nominal level of growth. Because as so many of our excellent panelists have highlighted, it is really the cost of our debt that will matter far more than our level of debt. I am less concerned about interest rates rising over time, particularly for Canada, for a few key reasons. And one of the most challenging elements about being Canadian, as John highlighted, is that we are all at once very alone to defend our own interests, and yet so susceptible to global developments. And in this environment, for example, our interest rates will continue to be heavily dominated by global interest rates, which make us more susceptible to their development. But particularly, Canada's attractiveness is always relative to its global peers. And our debt, while it is quite high, is still looking somewhat favorable compared to many of our peers. So the demand for Canadian bonds, to me, is likely to remain robust. One of the limits on our fiscal side that I think we should be considering is being the cleanest, dirtiest shirt, which is to say that we should be monitoring just how attractive our fiscal landscape is relative to peers as one key consideration. Also highlight our Bank of Canada owns 36% of our Canadian government bond market, so very different than the 90s, which of course carries a whole different type of environment. I wanted to highlight on the concept of fiscal responsibility. There is so much emphasis, and I hear it today, the perception that we are out of crisis, that we are on the other side. We are not on the other side. We are still in a very fragile type of environment. Children, the fourth wave is the children's wave. My son's 4th birthday party was last weekend, invited 8 children to play outside. 3 of them from separate schools have COVID. 2 of their mothers have decided not to return to work because they cannot deal with the instability. Talk about confidence. There is no confidence when people are worried about whether they have to stay home because their child will be isolated for 10 days. 4th wave is the children's wave. And as much as we were worried about our elderly, I would not underestimate the sacrifices that parents will make when they worry about their children's health. We are not out of the woods on rising prices. And again, if prices are going to rise, and I 100% agree with John, we need a reshoring for our long-term prosperity, but that is going to come at a higher cost, initially to businesses and then to consumers. We are still, in my view, in a social crisis, as Tabitha outlined, non-Indigenous Canada only now awakening to its darker history. We are only now awakening to the crisis in our care economy, what we consider to be essential workers. This is not an environment, I think, yet where we should be pulling back, but one that we should make sure we don't pull back prematurely. And I'm not talking about expansive stimulus for years to come, but avoiding perhaps an accident by pulling back too quickly, particularly in the the next 6 to 12 months. I'm not sure if that encompasses all of the questions that came through, but perhaps I'll stop here for now. Thank you for sending the first question to me.
Thanks very much. John Manley, I've got a question from one of our participants virtually, who asks you to reflect on your experience in government and your experience in the private sector and comment on why don't they understand each other and how do we get them to work more effectively in the national interest?
I'm kind of an oddball because I have been in both. And something that we don't do very well in Canada is have people move back and forth between government and the private sector. I sometimes felt when I was leading the Business Council that my role was interpreter because the languages were so different. And I think at the core of it is there is that lack of exchange of experience back and forth. That comes with a certain lack of trust. I think in many parts of the government, there is the belief that business is all about profits, and a profit motive has got to be bad, and that it's kind of unseemly to deal with business. We're there to control their voracious, excessive appetites. The fact that some in government feel that way is exaggerated and believed en masse by business leaders who, again, would often, certainly they'll be polite and collaborative when, a minister wants to come to their facility, but they don't trust that government generally is going to maintain a steady hand, consistent policies that can be maintained over a period of time. It's popular in Canada to dislike the financial institutions. But, during the pandemic, and I guess I was a little bit close to this, I think our banks actually did an amazing service to Canadians. They did beyond what government asked them to do. They deferred payments on mortgages, on credit card debt, on commercial loans. They made sure that there was support for people to get their income support payments converted into cash in usable form. They were innovative and resilient, and their reward appears to be a 3% tax increase. So why would business be a little suspicious of government? I don't know. That sometimes it's just the way it goes. I think there are some things, though, that government needs to understand that are happening, and Francis talked a little bit about this in the discussion around green bonds. In the corporate world, the entire ESG movement is transforming the way major corporations behave. And, I chair two large Canadian corporations. I meet with investors, and increasingly the questioning is around ESG. I'm on the board of a corporation that has issued green bonds, in fact, and as Francis was saying, oversubscribed. And we think we're going to get a really favorable rate because we're going to overachieve the carbon reduction targets that are built into the bonds. So we get really low interest rate, we get a carbon reduction, and we've got investors that are happy. The role of government to sort of, coming out of the era when you had to control the excesses is being taken over to some degree by the investment community, which is now becoming that discipline on corporate behavior. Because if you don't measure up on ESG, they'll dump your stock, or they'll mount a campaign to dump your board. So I hope that there is an opportunity here for increased understanding on both sides, because I think the corporate sector has moved a long way in understanding why public objectives are important and why they have to be seen to be contributing to solutions and not causing problems, whether they're environmental or social or otherwise. But I'm not really sure that that has been absorbed on the government side yet.
Well, that's very interesting, John, because going back to your first point about the capacity of the banking system in Canada and the financial institution to absorb at the beginning the impact of the pandemic is so true. And we were able, when we did the work of the Council, to be able to observe that. And it would have been worse without that capacity of the banking system in Canada to proceed. So that's in my view very positive, and that's part of the comparative advantage to a certain extent of what we have in Canada. The second point about the ESG is also something that will change, hopefully, the outcome of those conversations between the private and the public sectors, because I'm also involved with 4 companies, public companies. We did some bond issues, very successful in the marketplace. And in fact, we need to move on with a view about the environment, a view about social issues, and a view about governance around stakeholders. So we are moving in a space that is much more global than it was maybe in the past. So I see it as being very positive, and hopefully this will bring a joint agenda. Tabata, I have a question for you. In your notes and remarks, you mention the growth of Indigenous business in Canada. In fact, in the report, we are talking about it. It's roughly $30 billion annually contribution to the economy. And if I understand, there is a plan coming from the community that you want to bring in eventually 5 years from now to over 100 billion, which is, in my view, very ambitious, but also very motivating. Could you explain, first of all, what would be this agenda to grow the business? Second, what are the conditions for success? And what are the key challenges that you would like to share with all of us?
Sure, thank you. So first I must give my remarks and kudos to those who came before me. So JP Gladue, who was my predecessor at CCAB, and Clint Davis, who was prior to him, and to Carol-Ann Hilton, who has really spearheaded this term called Indigenomics, about how do we grow forward, how do we get to 100 billion. And it's really been about Indigenous leaders in the economy coming together to understand what all of our roles are in that. So $100 billion is a goal, but it's kind of setting us on this trajectory together and this path together to see how we can get there. And prior to the 32 billion, we've seen this hockey stick type growth in the Indigenous economy. So in 2006, it was about 15 billion, 2016, 32 billion. Indigenous businesses as well. So between 2011 and 2016, we saw Indigenous businesses growing at a rate of 38%. That was about 46,000 businesses. Now we're over 60,000. So we're seeing this incredible, resilient growth. And when we think about the barriers I spoke about earlier, and we think about that loss of intergenerational wealth, if we're able to sustain that growth with the barriers in place, imagine what we could have done without them there. So part of it will definitely be about removing what those barriers are. The other piece is really about, I think, we're moving beyond the time of divisive conversations. We're moving towards partnerships. How do we build strong partnerships so that we can contribute to Canada and ensure that we're growing together? So I think that there's a few things for sure. One thing I think that's really has spearheaded the conditions is ESG. So earlier in the spring this year, the shareholders of the TSX group voted 98% in favor of TSX developing an Indigenous inclusion strategy and committing to Indigenous procurement. And we've seen that as well with Sun Life. I mean, it didn't have to go forward to a vote. They moved forward anyway. But this procurement, this idea and a movement on Indigenous procurement is having incredible ripple effects really throughout community. So if we think of some organizations like Corporate Canada, they're really leading the way on this. Suncor last year spent over $900 million with Indigenous business. And if you looked on the impact of closing the socioeconomic gaps in communities from that procurement, it really continues to make a change beyond just supporting that business. So, we're really pleased to see federal government's commitment to 5% procurement. If we think about the amount of money the federal government spends and the influx that can have into the Indigenous economy, that's a significant part of it. The National Indigenous Economic Development Board also came out with a report which showed that if Indigenous youth and Indigenous people had access to education and access to jobs the same as non-Indigenous people, then they would create $26.6 billion annually to GDP. So that's just within that portion. Some of the other things I think that we really need to consider and continue to create the conditions for success are Indigenous equity participation in projects. Yeah. And we saw this in the Clearwater deal. Incredible opportunity for the communities to be able to partner on the Clearwater deal. I know maybe Ed will talk about this later, but Chief Terrence Paul has said, we've been here for hundreds of years. We're not going anywhere. We're a long-term stable partner to be able to buy into this project. And that's a benefit to any corporation who's looking for a stable partner. Also supporting Indigenous exports. We've done some research that's showed that Indigenous businesses are twice as likely to export as non-Indigenous business. And we've been able to create some really incredible opportunities matching Indigenous businesses here in Canada with Indigenous businesses in Australia, where they've been able to partner on supply chain issues and supporting each other and creating sustainable products. And I think the other is definitely dedicated programming and really looking at the programming that's rolled out. So I've spoke about this before, but a number of the COVID programs that were rolled out, initially Indigenous businesses weren't eligible for. And we need to get to a place where that Indigenous businesses are not an afterthought, that all programming to support innovation funding and entrepreneurship is looked at across all of government, that it's not a Indigenous services economic development issue only. It's an all of government understanding about how we can really continue to support the Indigenous economy.
Well, thank you very much for all of that. A lot of good proposals, and we see that the agenda is very clear. I would like to build on your comment on procurement. I think that Canada, and I know, John, that you know this topic quite well, but we need to be certainly much more competitive when we look at some of our key neighbors, including the U.S. But that's another big topic.
Good point. Chris, I've got a question from our audience that wants to build on your eco-fiscal background. Is it realistic to think that Canada can retool its energy economy to benefit from a low-carbon economy, given our reliance on fossil fuels? Can Canada realistically expect to keep pace with other nations in the development of green technology?
This is a great question. I think the transition to net zero, which we are clearly embarked on now as a country, is going to be a fascinating economic transition. Economic transitions are always fascinating. This one is one that we're sort of driving toward intentionally. The economic transition that lasted for 125 years, that was out of agriculture and into services, wasn't a policy idea. It just sort of happened as technology changed in very fundamental ways. This transition is going to be, I think, fascinating, but it's also going to be complex, and it's also going to be filled with uncertainty. And it's more complicated in Canada than it is in France or Switzerland because we have so much fossil fuel production in this country. So just imagine how you in France, where I think France doesn't produce very much fossil fuels, certainly nothing like what Canada produces. The transition is fundamentally it's fundamentally a transition toward using cleaner power, okay? Whereas here, the transition is going to be about using cleaner power and about doing something with the fossil fuel production. So two quite competing views about what our transition will look like over the next 30 years, 40 years. One view is that we completely stop eventually producing fossil fuels. We just We phase out. Maybe it happens by itself, maybe it happens with policy, but you actually reduce fossil fuel production. Oil sands, conventional oil, natural gas, coal, and 50 years from now, we're just not producing any. That's one possible vision of the transition. Another very different view of the transition is that we will continue to produce fossil fuels and sell them to the world, because the world will continue to use many fossil fuels for many, many years. But if we're going to actually achieve net zero within 30 or 40 years, that means we're not getting the emissions from that production. That means something like carbon capture and storage is going to be developed, is going to be economical, scalable, safe, effective, and that's uncertain. We simply don't know whether, in Boundary Dam, which is in Estevan, Saskatchewan, carbon capture and storage is up and running. But whether you can make it cheap enough and make it scalable enough to actually keep producing Canada's fossil fuels is simply uncertain. And the actual path that we take might be in between those two extremes. And so I think the truth is that we don't know what this transition will look like. A very interesting report came out several months ago from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, which I think does great work on climate policy. And it showed many pathways to net zero by 2050. But if there is one takeaway that I took from that report, it's that getting to net zero by 2050 is absolutely possible, but that we do not know what the path will look like. And what that uncertainty means to me is that public policy needs to be very flexible. If we are going to make public investments in new technologies, and I suspect that we will and should, we need to make those investments in such a way that they will be flexible. Because we may put in several $1 billion into the development of green hydrogen and then realize that it's not going to work. And what you then want to be able to do is to be nimble enough in terms of public policy to switch that funding. That suggests to me that it's not going to be funding decisions that are made by a minister, but funding decisions that are made by some arm's length, probably still owned by government entity, because I think you want to take this out of the day-to-day political process. So I think there are many, many tough issues there, but we are going to be talking about it for a long time.
Thanks very much.
Alors, je crois qu'à ce moment-ci, on a...
So I believe we had an indication that Senator Diane Bellemare, who is very recognized for her professional background in the matter, has a question and comments. Thank you. I have a comment to echo all of our panelists who came to tell us that future prosperity, inclusive prosperity, will also depend on major investments in workforce and professional development. So I have a few comments to make on that subject. They're quite short. And my question was, what should I say to convince you, not necessarily you, because you're already convinced, but those who are listening, and how to convince others to invest in the establishment of social infrastructure, a more high-performing social infrastructure to stimulate the development of human capital and lifelong skills. Because when we look at it, investment in skills and human capital is a necessary condition for inclusive prosperity in the context of the Fourth Revolution. So I have a few facts that I'll give you. I hope that you'll be able to use them to convince others. First of all, I think we can say that the Fourth Industrial Revolution will require major investments in the skills development of the workforce and individuals as well. Just before the pandemic began, the OECD said, you'll recall, that in the next few years, including Canada, for which it has similar forecasts, 14% of jobs will disappear, and 42% will be completely transformed. And when we look at it, the pandemic has likely exacerbated the issue. That's the first fact. Secondly, The fourth industrial revolution will require the continuous development of digital skills for the workforce and also for individuals, because the workforce will work with new technologies and artificial intelligence, and Canadians will need to use products or listen to or submit to pressures from companies asking them when they can do online billing rather than paper billing. So in any case, the use of digital skills will benefit all of Canada. It's an absolute necessity. The third thing to take into account, in a survey that I conducted in December 2019 through my office on skills development, the survey indicated that 52% of employed Canadians, about 10 million Canadians, are aware of the transformations in the labor market related to artificial intelligence. That's a lot of people. They are aware of the OECD forecasts. 56.4% of the Canadian workforce, and that's about 11.4 million people, are ready to start training to develop their skills. It's wrong that they don't want to. They said they were ready to do so. But 40% of them don't do so because they don't have the means or the time to do so. Our survey also found that 48.4% of the active population, 9.8 million people in total, or nearly 1 in 2, think that they need to take computer training, IT training. And that's true for the over 55 crowd, but also for young people. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Fourthly, most developed countries in Europe, Asian countries, several countries in the Americas, as well as Australia and New Zealand, and all the European Union as well, have reflected on this issue and have started developing infrastructure to make major investments, and they have adopted national competency frameworks to certify individuals' competencies, to name them, and even to measure the level of acquired competencies. Canada has done work on that, but we're really lagging what's being done in the European Union, which has defined frameworks for member countries, and they're having discussions among themselves on this topic. These same countries have adopted measures, financial and budgetary measures, to fund investment in the development of essential and occupational skills. I'm thinking, for example, of France, which has developed a personal training account, and others have developed other financial incentives. If we come back to the survey that we carried out in my office, we learned that most Canadians would invest in their training if they received assistance from employment insurance or a personal account. And finally, to follow up on our report, and also to develop this social infrastructure, in like many countries that have started a social dialogue, on how partnerships are needed, and the social dialogue is an expression that covers all forms of partnership that are possible. So given the number of countries that are practicing social partnerships, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments should work together with private sector stakeholders to address the challenge effectively to establish inclusive prosperity. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this way of seeing skills development through creation of social infrastructure, and we finance individuals' training needs. Thank you. Senator, thank you very much for this very evocative, these evocative facts that you shared. I think there is no prosperity, no sustainable prosperity without human capital, which is at the heart of this vision. And so you shared some very interesting solutions, and I think also businesses and governments have a role to strike partnerships with Canadians to allow us to move forward and ensure that we put the human being at the beginning, at the heart of everything.
In fact, we should be ending reasonably soon. I'd like to do one rapid 1-minute round. If there are conclusions or insights that haven't been debated that you think should be, or ones that you would like to underscore, and I'm going to do it in the following order of seating. Monique, premier à vous.
Monique, to you first.
And finally, Francis, over to you at the end.
Well, very quickly, I would say that let's move forward all together for this sustainable prosperity vision. It's about partnership, it's about working together, and it's about an action plan. So let's hope that we can move in that direction with this fabulous session today. Thank you very much.
Let's see. John Manley.
I think if you did one of those scans counting the frequency with which a word is used in your report, one of the words that would be really high on the list is transition. And I think I think what's key there, we're talking about transitioning to a carbon-free economy, transitioning in terms of human resources, transitioning with an aging society, transitioning in a whole series of ways. I think we need to get our minds around how we make those transitions as quickly as possible and as sensitively as possible to the disruption that undoubtedly will be felt by many in our society. So I think the use of transition as opposed to something that sounds a lot more immediate is the right approach. But I kind of feel like the train of the future is coming at us very quickly, and that transition, if we don't make progress rapidly on it, we're just going to be diving for the ditch to get out of the road of the train.
Thanks, Tabitha.
Thank you. I think I would just like to speak to the opportunity. So as national Indigenous leaders in the space of economy, we have been gathering since COVID started on a bi-weekly basis to determine a national Indigenous economic strategy. And I'm hopeful that that will fit well into the economic growth strategy that's recommended in the paper. And you know, there's a real opportunity for us to continue to work together and to grow economy together. So,
thank you. Chris.
I think all of the things that are talked about in this report are important, and none of them are easy. And so 2 points. Number one, I think it's really important that we talk about this more as a country and talk about the many difficult things that I think need to be done. And the second thing is, I think nobody should be looking for the single big policy move that will make a big difference. I think that is, I think that's a pipe dream. I think you need to look at many, many, many small things that make a little bit of difference here and there. And I think we should be mindful, back to one of John's comments, I think we should be mindful of the limitations of what government actually can do. Yeah. His description of the economy as the result, the aggregation of millions of decisions on a daily basis is absolutely right. But those decisions, of course, are being made within a context that is heavily influenced by what government does or does not do. So let's just not look for the wonderful silver bullet, but let's look for creating that really good, solid environment.
Thank you. Last word, Francis.
I will echo Tabitha that as much as we are faced with a whole list of challenges, not the least of which is that we are on our own but within a global context, now is a moment for opportunity, and this report highlights just how great and prosperous we could be. It's a moment to become a more self-sufficient nation. It's a moment to become a more self-aware nation. It's a moment to become a greener nation, but it requires a rethink of just about every element of how we design it. And we pretty much need to recognize that this is the pivotal moment. We need to grab it by its horn and realize that there is, as Chris said, a lot that needs to be revisited and redone, but it's not going to happen in 1 year or with one policy. So I think we need every voice that's been on this panel to keep bringing those different voices and even more voices added to the discussion as the conversation continues.
Thank you.
Well, as co-chair, Senator, may I ask you what you think? What is your 1 minute and closing words?
Good question. Good question.
That wasn't in my script.
No, I know.
Well, thank you. I think the insight I took from the work that we did, as important as the what do we do and the broad nature of the what, it's how we do things in Canada. And unless and until we can get governments aligned and key stakeholders involved seriously so that they feel committed to a two-way street of consensus, we will never succeed, because the government of Canada, even if it were willing and able, could not do it alone. So we need to spend some time, particularly in this chamber, thinking about the how, not just the what. With that, I want to thank everybody. We will be back at 3 o'clock sharp with former Prime Minister Clark and former Premier Clark with Ed Greenspan. So thank you very much, panel. It's been a great delight. To come back. And I welcome everybody back, including those that are online. And I'm told that the online presence has not diminished over the course of the last panel. So I'm very grateful for that. And grateful for those who are in the room here. For the next hour or so, we want to discuss how, in this diverse country with many competing regional priorities, how we might find agreement in putting into place a prosperity agenda that benefits all Canadians and all regions. To provide us their views and past experience, we're very honored and privileged today to have two eminent Canadians, each of whom have played lead roles in the life of our country. First, I'd like to introduce Christy Clark, who served as Premier of British Columbia from 2011 to 2017. Premier Clark's tenure as Premier saw 5 straight balanced budgets and an economy that was working strongly and growth at one point that enjoyed the highest GDP growth in the nation. Congratulations, Premier.
Thank you.
Our other guest is former Prime Minister Joe Clark. I had the privilege of working for Joe Clark when he was leader of the opposition. I had the privilege of continuing to be his friend. He has been Prime Minister of Canada. He has been a distinguished minister in 2 outstanding roles, but he continues to participate in the public debate in Canada and around the world. I also would like to introduce to you Ed Greenspon. Many of you will know Ed as the editor of the Globe and Mail in its better days. Ed is now the president of the Public Policy Forum.
We've all lost at one point.
The Public Policy Forum has been a friend of the modern Senate. Some senators will recall that the Public Policy Forum sponsored a paper by 2 distinguished former senators on the roadmap ahead for a modern Senate and hosted a colloquium on that subject. And it was only natural that the Public Policy Forum would put his hand up to be a partner in this exercise. And Ed, welcome, and especially to the Public Policy Forum for your role. And over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Merci beaucoup, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter. I would like to first of all congratulate you and the other senators on this magnificent and important report.
All provided some important insights and proposed pathways for the Canadian economy, which, as you know, is enriching the debate about how we secure Canada's future prosperity. And, you know, perhaps more than that, you've underscored the value with this report, I believe, of an independent Senate that can both fulfill the vision of a chamber of sober second thought as imagined by John A. Macdonald, but also organize itself to deliver sober first thoughts as well, and to initiate and be in front of debates, which I think is an important point. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss the work that you've done, and particularly the context in which it lands with two of our nation's most prominent political Clarks. The Right Honourable Joe Clark, Canada's 16th Prime Minister, and Christy Clark, the 35th Premier of British Columbia. And we are going to start with a chat among ourselves, and then we'd like to open it up to you as well. There's a couple of interveners. We expect to pose very tough questions. I don't think that there's any questions after years in politics that can bamboozle you in any way. So, but they're going to test the proposition nonetheless. We will see. And so, just before we start, maybe I just want to clarify for everybody: there is no relation, right? No relationship. No.
Not that I know.
I mean, maybe 17 generations back or something of that sort.
There's a lot of Clarks.
Yeah,
That's right.
Aren't there?
There are.
Yeah, even as BC premiers, in fact. So, okay, well, look, let's start out with the fact that you both have held elected office. You've both been in cabinets, you've both led governments, and you've had to find a way to make policies acceptable to publics. So, Mr. Clark, let's start with you. How difficult is it, do you think, in these days to forge the kind of political consensus that would be necessary for the sort of document that we're seeing here and the sort of vision we're seeing?
I think consensus is much more difficult now than it was. I think that there was a sense, even among partisans, at least in the national parliament, I can't speak for the legislature of BC, to, at the end of the day, by and large, come to agreement. And I think that that is less the case now. And it's a major fault for a country like ours, because we are not simply a federation, we're a diverse federation, not fragile, in my view, but not as strong as we like to believe we are. And when there was a sense of cooperation within legislatures or parliaments, not all the time, obviously, it was often rare, but a capacity to come to agreement on things, I think that had an effect upon the general public atmosphere of seeking to agree. So, in that context, if I may, I think that this report is a very helpful step forward. And I hope it can, I think it was framed in that spirit, and I hope that it can be pursued in that spirit generally. But we need more examples of this, because we are, if one tries to trace times when institutional strength goes up and it goes down, we are on a downward curve now at a very dangerous time for a country like ours or any country to be at a downward curve.
Just for a moment, do you think that is that a cyclical curve, do you think, or is that a more fundamental downward slope?
I worry it isn't cyclical because, and remember, I come from a certain era and a certain background. I came from a time when national parties meant something. And it could be said of all the national parties of my era that they were broadly representative of the country. I've said before that I learned more about my country in a national political party than I did anywhere else. Now the parties are less inclusive than they need to be. And to a remarkable degree, they seem to be interested in being less inclusive than they need to be. What that meant, that experience in the cabinets of which I was part, is that the great majority of people who went into cabinet had direct personal experience with others who came from elsewhere, came quite deeply from elsewhere, but had learned to get along. We had become a family of difference. And that made an immense, that was quite significant when we came down to actually looking at public policy and how, wherever it emerged, it might be modified or applied across a diverse country and into a wider world. I'm not sure that's the case now. I also have to say, and I don't mean to sound too old-fashioned, that caucuses mattered more in those days than they do now. A leader has always had authority. Sometimes the authority of a leader is less than others, but nonetheless, a leader has always had authority. And I think, but I think now the leader's authority and the authority of the entourage of the leaders is more dominant than it has been or than it should be. And I think that's another barrier we have to crack, in my view.
Christy, I want you to go down the same road for a minute, if you will. Is the system by which we have found agreement on tough issues or routes to follow, is it broken? Is there even a system anymore?
Well, I think leadership matters a lot in this country, and I mean in every country. And I think the habit that we've gotten into in our federation, where it's feds beat up on the prime minister, beats up on the premiers, and the premiers beat up on the prime minister, has done. I mean, we don't talk about that as polarization, but that is really what's happened. And as long as each sees each other as a convenient punching bag, I don't think we're going to get much consensus in the country, and we don't have much leadership then either, because. And this was the thing that I liked about the report the best, although there's lots of great things in it, is this idea that we need an institution, or we need a method to bring the provinces and the federal government together, because the provinces have unique jurisdiction. And Prime Minister Clark, Prime Minister Chrétien, Prime Minister Mulroney, Prime Minister Martin all really understood that division of powers and respected it. And understood that in order to make Canada work, you got to work together. And there was lots of compromise back in those days. And so I think the proposal in the report that suggests that, that there could be a prosperity group that would come together, set measurements, is really, really important to bring people together. But ultimately, if people don't want to get along, if people are spoiling for a fight, which is what we saw over the carbon tax, which was, I thought, a terrible mess for Canada, could have been a tremendous accomplishment. Instead, it's mostly failed across the country. If we can find a way to get along, because leaders decide they choose to get along, like you would in any marriage, then we will have a better country. And I think Canadians would be wise to think about the character of the leaders they are electing and what they're going to bring to that conversation if we want to keep Canada together.
Well, I want to come back to the Federation and the Prosperity Council idea in a few moments for sure. Let's just stick with the idea of the forces that sort of seem to pull people more apart now. And indeed, whether the pandemic pulls us together, pulls us apart in some ways. Now, certainly the Senate report sees the pandemic as a pivotal moment, almost a Second World War opportunity kind of moment to redefine where we're going. Do you let me start with you, and then I'll go to Joe Clark. Do you agree that are we at some kind of pivotal moment that presents an opportunity to redefine the course we're on?
Ed, I've heard people talk about this as kind of a World War II, post-World War II experience. In World War II, we had leaders that people looked to, leaders that were having tough conversations with Canadians and leaders around the world who were doing the same with their citizenry. We had national unity around it. We had governments that worked together, and we really had an overwhelming sense of purpose. So, what do we have now? We have protests. We have political parties that have grown out of the pandemic that are taking huge swaths of the vote, or huge swaths of numbers in vote across the country. We have leaders who are fighting with one another, practically at fisticuffs, and we have protests happening here. I would argue this is not post-World War II. This is more like post-Vietnam. We just have these deep, deep social divisions that have been deepened, exposed, and then I think further deepened by the pandemic, and that in itself presents a new problem. Rather than kind of a healing moment, I think we're actually at probably a more fragile moment than we've been for a long time.
Okay, fair enough. So force of division. There are some forces, presumably of solidarity too, but where would you come down on that?
I think we're fragile. I think we're all fragile. COVID was a shock to everyone. And as the earlier discussions indicated, it was a greater shock to some than to others, but it was a shock to all of us. And we're not out of it. And living with that kind of uncertainty creates a sense of fragility. It may also create a greater disposition to examine ourselves, to say, okay, things we didn't expect to happen, happened. More things we don't expect are likely to happen. How do we deal with this? I think that there are some people whose bruising we underestimate. And again, I think they tend to be people who are less prepared for financial or for other reasons to deal with this and don't have a lot of help in dealing with it. But I collectively, we are in a position where we have to say, okay, what I thought worked, didn't pay much attention to it, but I thought it was working, doesn't. What else doesn't work? And what should we be doing to identify the changes that we can make? So I think there is when things are going well, it's fairly easy to identify a common sense of opportunity. It may well be that when things are going badly, there can also be that response to a common opportunity. What is important is common. We have to do it together. And I am I had some successes in public life, and I had some flamboyant lacks of success. And one of them, by some reading, was that a constitutional accord that I chaired was roundly and enthusiastically rejected by most of the people of the country. And that's become its signature. But what it really did was get the Federation together, all the premiers, all the heads of government of the territories, 4 highly respected and representative leaders of the Indigenous community in the country, and we came at the end of the day to a unanimous agreement on a range of very substantial changes and issues in the country. Now, I'm not disputing the electoral decision. It was, on other occasions, in partisan ways, I have disputed it, but I'm not doing that now. What I'm saying is that there was an example there. And part of it was that we first of all recognized what we had done wrong before. In our earlier attempts at constitutional change, we had left out critical groups. And naturally, one of them had an eagle feather, which he waved in the legislature of Manitoba and brought down the process, and probably should have. So we went out deliberately to try to be much more inclusive, both in the agenda and in the style than we were. And as I say, sitting around those interminable discussions, and you've been through interminable discussions, we actually got very real agreement from people whom you would not think would agree. This is not out of school. I can say that one of the most difficult people to persuade was the then Premier of Newfoundland, Clyde Wells, a person who was absolutely critical at the end of the day in persuading him was the Premier of Alberta, Don Getty, who, using powers he must have learned in a football huddle, was able to go down and persuade Clyde Wells to move a little bit. But the point is that when we were together, when we overcame the sense that we were representing different poles, when we thought we had a common interest, then we found a way to agree. What do I learn from that? I think that there can be replicas of that idea. I agree absolutely with Christie's view that there has to be much more cooperation among the formal leaders of our federation. And but I also think it can occur. You've seen it occur.
Yep.
And I think that there has to be much. I think we've got to be much less insular than we have been in the past, and begin to be inclusive in the discussion of public debate. And you need things to talk about where consensus can be gathered, and there are at least some elements of the report that we're dealing with today that fill that bill, not least because they are addressing, as governments have to, questions of real current urgency in the world. And I don't fault professional public services. I don't fault anyone else who has a job to do. What I do believe is that if we are focusing narrowly on our responsibility, we're probably missing something. All of us need outside advice and perspectives and encouragement. And I think that these kinds of reports on the one hand, but also the kind of broad discussion that we were able to engender during the Charlottetown process can cause people who would not otherwise agree come to say, I've got more in common here than I thought. And that's worth doing.
Okay, let me ask you a case study as well that you were involved in, obviously, with Premier, which is around energy. And energy in a couple of different ways, certainly. Alberta's energy coming through BC, which was a very difficult proposition and a lot of noise around it. And of course, your own LNG desire for LNG development, which also had a lot of noise around it. How did you cope with both of those in trying to forge a consensus? And do you feel that you did it?
So can I just start by saying one of the best things that's happened as a result of the pandemic coming to its conclusion, is that energy prices are going back up again, which is great for Canada because we are an energy superpower, or we want to be, and it's going to mean much more investment in the oil sands and gas and across the country, which will mean more money for healthcare. So I think I feel like I've been really the opposite of Pollyannish so far, sitting beside Prime Minister Clark, feeling a little negative. So I do think that's something really positive that came out of it. And we landed a $40 billion private sector investment with LNG. We got it past the point of no return before the new government could come in and cancel it. And they did, however, cancel or cause to be canceled all of the other proposals that were in the pipeline. Nonetheless, that project's going ahead. And we also, set out the 5 conditions to enable Alberta Oil to move through British Columbia. That's been kind of slowly but surely moving forward. It was really, really hard. I mean, it's so easy to just say, this is not in my electoral interest, so therefore I'm not going to do it. The much wiser thing, I think, to do, and why would you get into politics unless you were going to try and do things, is to say, okay, this is going to be hard. Everybody hates it right now, but I bet I can get enough people to like it that if I'm persuasive enough, if I'm smart enough in figuring out how to accommodate people, we can get there. Now, the thing that I learned about LNG in particular was there's 2 things. First, that the outcome we got to, just in terms of how we structured it, like everything from the royalties to the Indigenous agreements to the training regime that we put in place, gave us a totally different result than we expected. Like, we still ended up with a $40 billion investment, but the actual agreements that we got were way better than I thought that they would ever be. And in fact, I didn't even really think about that at the very beginning. So that's one thing. It was the product of a lot of compromise, a lot of listening, and it gave us a product that we could sell. The second thing that I learned from this is that it is so vital to reconciliation with First Nations people to do resource development. Because what I heard when we did 40 different agreements across the line from the Alberta border to the BC coast, and what we heard from those Indigenous people was, you white people have come into our land and for over 150 years have told us we can't use our land. That you get to use it, you get to take the benefits, and you get to go spend them down in Vancouver or Toronto or wherever your investment goes. And the only resource that many of these communities have left to get is a new piece of pie, which is oil and gas. And so I would argue that the most important learning I got from it was that the way to reconciliation is we do need to apologize, we do need to reconcile, we do need to learn. But unless First Nations have the means to guarantee economic success and a way to get out of poverty, they will not succeed. And the really the primary means for them to get there in Canada is through resource development. So we have to get our heads around deciding to say we are going to develop resources in Canada because that's going to do so much to help eliminate poverty in First Nations communities. And without eliminating poverty, we will never have reconciliation. And that was the most important lesson I learned.
Well, Tabitha Bull spoke a few minutes ago about Indigenous equity ownership, and she cited particularly the Clearwater deal. And PPF did a session with the main seller John Risley and the main buyer Chief Terry Paul last February. And Terry Paul said they had to go in 50-50 with the BC company, Premium Brands. They wanted to own it 100% themselves, but they couldn't get the financing for 100%. So they had to go 50-50. And they said to Premium, "Are you a long-term investor?" And Premium said, "Yes, we are." And they said, "Well, what's long-term?" And they said, Premium said 30 years. And Terry Paul said, "That's great, fabulous, because for us, long-term is forever. And in 30 years, we're going to buy out your 50%.
Right on. Yeah.
And I thought, that's a wonderful ambition. When you talk about LNG, the Haisla are building the Cedar LNG plant, which people in this part of Canada don't know about, but in your part of Canada, I think do. At least they're, moving to feasibility on that plant. So I think that's an important part of the vision, obviously.
I was sitting with the guys from Petronas in Malaysia and some First Nations folks from British Columbia. And the Malaysian guy's talking on and on about how he understands colonialism because the Brits were there, and they'd finally got the rights to their gas back and all that stuff. And this guy said, "Yeah, and we're really happy." I think he was a Lac Kw'alaams guy. "We're really happy that you're investing here with us in our resource, because just like you got it back from the British, we're going to get it back from you, pal." And that's how the world should be working, is we should be returning those resources. And when we develop those resources, that money's going to stay in communities, and it's not going to leave Canada. It's going to be spent in communities, particularly small towns across the country.
But when is a very optimistic word as opposed to if, and I appreciate your optimism. So I want to go back to maybe Charlottetown, because Charlottetown was a group of elites who agreed to something, and then a public that was angry, perhaps for economic reasons, perhaps for constitutional reasons.
A public and a very prominent former prime minister who was very angry.
Absolutely, but the point I want to make is I want to compare it in some ways to today, because it's kind of curious to me, after so many years of stagnant growth in living wages for people, that they're not angrier. That they're not actually, or at least maybe their anger is inchoate. They're not demanding more of politicians for the kind of growth agenda, prosperity agenda. Why is that?
I think they are. I think they're not accustomed to turning to politicians for positive action. It happens occasionally, but I don't think it happens enough. Much more often, frequently, somebody goes and knocks on the door and feels that they're not being heard. And so what does that mean? That happens everywhere. Yeah, I was talking to someone much more worldly than I am the other day, and I said, "All right, name a successful government in the world." And he said Singapore. And I said, "Okay, name a second one." And he was stumped. But the point is, this is a very, very difficult time in the world. Lots of countries have challenges. We've got to find some way to cause Canadians to become aware of just how fortunate we are if we begin to work at it. And part of what you have found in dealing with Indigenous people is that when you give them some hope, many of them, their leaders, will respond to it and make the most of it. But if they feel they are excluded, they're going to act like they're excluded. And our capacity as a country, compared to all, we really are one of the most fortunate. Everyone says this, but it has never been more true, because we've always said it in the shadow of the United States. We're one of the most successful countries in the world. Well, by almost every standard, we're a more successful country than they are now. We're a more durable country, and we're a more durable country than most are. How do we cause people who sort of know that in their bones, how do we cause people to understand that? I think the issue is to engage them as much as we can on very specific matters and as broadly as we can. And I want to come back to You know, when we were, I'm sorry to go back to Charlottetown, except it was obviously, it is on my mind. When we were starting, the popularity of the Mulroney government was as close to the basement as you could possibly be. And I realized that we were going to have a lot of trouble with a skeptical public. I went to 5 public policy groups in the country, yours one of them, and asked them to co-sponsor a series of public debates. The Canada West Foundation said, sure, we'll help you if 50% of the participants in the discussions are, quotes, ordinary Canadians. And I said, I can't do 50, but I can do 25%. And we set up a process. It was run by the late Arthur Kruger, an eminently respected public servant, who at one time when I, as the mere minister, tried to intrude on his authority, said, sir, this is my responsibility, not yours. And we all understood that. Anyway, Arthur was in charge, and we invited people to write in. Do you think you know as much as Joe Clark does about the Constitution? There were swarms of people who were in that category and wrote in and applied. And we went through meticulously and had and selected. And in the actual discussions, time after time, the Canadian Labour Congress and the Chamber of Commerce would make their usual positions, and some ordinary Canadian, there with the same authority they had, would intervene and say, well, that's very interesting, I disagree. And anyway, that process of genuine involvement of people who are serious, who are not there just to talk, are there to help solve an issue, worked. And all of us know, sometimes to our sorrow, that there are a lot of variants to public participation now in discussion. There's also a lot of chatter, and chatter is of almost no use in getting to solutions. But if you can get people in a context where they feel they are equal, they feel they are being heard, then I think that they are going to recognize how fortunate they are to live in this country, take a hard look at what can be done and act on it. So I think that part of what's happening is that our accepted processes of governing are not working anywhere near as well as we expect them to be. And we don't need to throw them out, but we do have to open them up so that there can be more participation by more serious people, to find more serious people to come to decisions.
So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and I'm going to try to, and then I'm going to open it up. But do you think perhaps one of the problems we have in building consensus, engaging the public, and perhaps getting them to put pressure on is that, we're just to have a very exclusive vocabulary. So we talk about prosperity, we talk about productivity, we talk about growth. Funny, when daycare becomes an economic issue of growth, people, it seems, can relate to that. So do we just need to also rethink how we talk about this?
I think yes. I think that's spot on. Daycare, housing, access to housing. I do think, though, that we have a couple of generations who've grown up in abundance, real, true, like the most abundant society ever in the history of human settlement is now. I think it's come to an end. I don't think people have quite caught up with that yet. And I think, so we're either going to have to, we're either going to get onto this conversation quickly, or we're going to find ourselves in a very, very difficult situation. So that's, again, why I think this report is so timely. But I think there are a couple of good things on the horizon. One is Gen Z, which is, this generation of kids who grew up in the midst of the meltdown. Lots of their parents lost jobs. Lots of the kids who were at their school might have, been talking about that. They're way more hardworking. They are way more worried. They are way more like my grandparents than just about any generation in between. So that's actually not a bad thing. Their expectations are lower, and their capacity for kind of taking it, their expectations are lower, and I think they're going to work hard to try and get somewhere. I think, though, what they're going to experience is they're going to experience, ultimately, a failure of our healthcare system. I mean, that's where this is all headed, really, right? When Canada runs out of money, we run out of our ability to fund a universal, fully equitable, the richest healthcare system in the world. So that, but I think it's, we're at a moment where it's either going to go really wrong, and that's when people are going to wise up, or this next generation is going to help us all come to our senses. But I ultimately, I also do think that where we're going economically and the failure of the public to kind of grasp that has been a failure of the media. And you know how this is. Newspapers and news organizations are starved for money, and reporters are younger, less experienced, have less time, and are covering way more issues much more shallowly. So I think that's a very big problem. And the work that Chris Reagan's doing over at McGill, for example, to helping to educate journalists is really important. And I think we need leadership. I think we need leaders. We haven't had a prime minister who's talked about the economy as a problem and as an issue that needs to be managed, and premiers in quite a long time. We really need to be having that discussion, and leadership really matters in that discussion.
Well, I think what we have is political leaders, we just had an election. Political leaders, every political leader talks about the economy in terms of redistributive policies, in terms of consumption policies. We will consume, we will, take 2% of taxes here and 3% of taxes there, and we will, put a chicken in your pot. And even when they talk about things, it seems to me, like affordability of housing, which is an issue that was perhaps invented in British Columbia, they talk about it only in terms of the cost side, but not in terms of, well, your income has been stagnant for many years, and that's part of the problem too. So what's with that? Why are we only talking about one side of the equation? Is that the political reward system?
No, it's not. I mean, what I'm pausing because I'm going to, I guess, answer a slightly different question. And I'm going to recall the growth and power of interest groups. And I do it because there was a time, again in political parties, when people with different interests came together and they converged. And what happened with the power of interest groups, people interested in something that directly interests them, is that they then became less interested in others. They were very focused upon their own particular goals. And one of the features in the last election campaign was that there was really no attempt to engage others. As somebody who is a certified, long-standing progressive, I'm sick and tired of having progressives casting the other, everyone else as curmudgeons. That's just not the case. But we're looking through a very narrow lens. And part of it is we have those institutions that used to bring interests and people together are no longer doing it. So what can? And I think that the possibility of serious discussion of issues that are obviously of importance to people can do that. Now, I agree absolutely that they have to be put in a language that can be understood. This isn't going to be won by the economists. This is going to be won by people who are able to take economic reality and put it in ordinary terms that get down into households. We have to draw people back to an interest in public life. The last election saw people either leaving, not voting, or in an alarming development, as you said, opting for a very extreme no-point alternative, and doing that in large numbers and in unexpected places. I was surprised at the responses in BC. Now, this isn't about the charisma of a guy who ran fourth in the Beauce. This is about a real concern about the validity, the pertinence of public policy. And so we have to find ways in which the pertinence of public policy is restored. And it may be that a post-COVID period presents us with an opportunity, providing that opportunity is also matched by actual proposals upon which people might act, which is what this committee has been trying to do.
Okay, let me turn it over. We have an intervener, who is Senator Brent Cotter. from Saskatchewan. And Brent is a former Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs in Saskatchewan, and he is down that way and has a question.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Mr. Clark and Ms. Clark, for really inspiring us and being here and helping us in thinking many of these things through. I wanted to borrow two or three of the remarks that you made, one that Mr. Manley made a little bit earlier in sort of maybe three themes, and try to weave them together. I think part of this report angled toward the question of whether there's the potential for cooperative federalism these days in ways that don't appear to be self-evident. Mr. Clark, you started there. And recognizing, Premier Clark, your observation about how decentralized a country we are and the authority that resides in provincial and territorial governments in economic and social terms. And picking up the point that Mr. Manley made, that there is a train that's coming faster than these trains tend to usually come in our direction, not just about geopolitics, but jobs of the future, Indigenous reconciliation and economic development, climate change challenges that are all national challenges for us, the nature of the future of the Canadian economy, and whether we need a big crisis or a big opportunity combined with a more visionary leadership to make the kind of constructive entanglement of our respective jurisdictions pull in the same direction. And I guess the question is whether there's enough at stake right now that leaders will look beyond the kind of narrow perspectives of their immediate obligations in ways that happened around Charlottetown, that happened after the Second World War, that happened in pulling together Medicare, for example, which was a merger of federal and provincial jurisdictions to make a big national program come together. Even it is said that the Prime Minister and Premiers have been meeting regularly through the pandemic, First Minister's meetings virtually. Is that possible? Is this report too naive in thinking that this is a moment in time when that kind of constructive entanglement of jurisdictions pulling in the same direction can meaningfully assist us as a country?
You're going to need help. First of all, we don't want to count on crisis, on a deeper crisis, because crisis affects people disproportionately. It affects different, and it could lead to more despair and more radical behavior. There needs to be a simple reassertion of the respectability of government, that the government cares, and it's not necessarily put in dollar terms what we're going to do for you or what we're going to do necessarily for your cause, but that it's a serious government. We're serious about the idea of governance. I think that an agency that is worth looking at is some creative, constructive use of First Ministers' conferences. I think they can be very productive. They can be divisive, of course, but they can be very productive. They have been on climate matters in several occasions. But I think we also have to look around at who's out, who could be brought in. Not who are the furious, but who are the dissatisfied, and about what are they dissatisfied, and how can they be brought in and show an interest in their cause, not show an interest in not. And I think that the political parties are slipping into a situation where they're all seen as being more interested in themselves than in the public they're appealing. So I'm not sure you can. I don't think there's any magic here. But I think there may be some learning from some things that have worked in the past in terms of drawing the Federation together. And there's another dimension that is emerging now. I'm sorry to do this. I don't recall a time in Canada when racism has been as evident, when there has been as much focusing on particular groups as there is now with Canadians of Asian origin. I've seen that happen individually. I've never seen it happen as a phenomena in the country before, and it's very dangerous. It's very troubling to a lot of people like us who have an idea of the country. I say that simply because I think that there is a risk that new small c crises are going to creep up on us and are going to cut away at us now that we're weak, and so that we're relatively weak. So there has to be some attention to identifying and asserting the strengths of this quite fortunate country, including the nature of our federation, which has not simply been a mechanical instrument. There have been various premiers of various parties in various provinces through history who have come together to try to make real progress. And I think those are issues that we have to focus on. Now, I think that in fact, you're providing them some fodder with that. There are things around which people could agree in this report. But I think it would be, I think we are in more trouble than we should be as a country, and we're not showing very much evidence of ways in which we might address that problem.
Just on the point you made about, as British Columbia, this issue of anti-Asian racism is a very real thing. And, I know that politicians do need to talk about, we need to talk about anti-racism, and we need to talk about, ways, it's encouraging people to be more welcoming. I can't think of any better way for governments to make the point about racism than welcoming more immigrants. Than the government saying, we need more immigrants coming to this country from all over the world. Let's welcome them. Let's make this our national project. And this Canada's been the home for people from all over the world. All of us come from somewhere, unless we're of First Nations descent. So I think, I just sort of on that point. But I do think in terms of, to your point, Senator, specifically, this idea that there could be a national body, as suggested in the report, that would be bringing everybody together on a regular basis, that would be a third party, that would be kind of political, because I don't think, no offense, Chris, but the academics can really do this on their own. We really do need people who have some political experience in their background, and force everybody to get in the room and really help set the agenda for what needs to be discussed, and then force everybody to discuss it. I was my first year as chairing the premiers was also the first year that we went to 2 premiers conferences a year. So I've been to a lot of them, and every year they got worse and they got harder to do. And they became more political. They became more about scoring points and what do I want. They became more selfish as the years went on. So it doesn't mean it wasn't a great institution at the beginning and it didn't work at the beginning. I think it's run its course. So these Fed-Prov meetings really need a third party, a legitimate third party who's going to drive the agenda and bring them together.
Do you see this? You mentioned the Prosperity Council earlier that's mentioned in the report. Do you see that helping to serve that function?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a Senate-led, I've had a mixed relationship with the institution of the Senate, as I said to Senator Harder earlier. But I do think that the role that the Senate plays best is as a home of second sober second thought, and really forward planning, thinking about the problems, being able to set aside politics amongst a group of people who intimately understand politics, but nonetheless don't let it get in their way. I think that could be a third party, along with, supported by some really important, some of the economic leaders in the country, like a Public Policy Forum or, the Canada Industry Council, you name it. But making sure that discussion is a fulsome discussion, because I can't tell you how sick I am of having this discussion about getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. We dropped all the interprovincial trade barriers in British Columbia. We said, okay, we're just going to get naked here. And nobody else did, not even Saskatchewan. And we have had that discussion 1,000 times, and it's not going anywhere. Provinces and the feds need a push.
Let me go to a couple of these other questions. I'm going to go in a minute also. I'll just give him a 2-minute warning to Robert Asselin, who is online with a question, the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Business Council of Canada, because maybe business has part of that push, I don't know. The first question here, perhaps you've already answered, but I do want to give you the opportunity and the question of the opportunity. It's clear from the statistics we've seen that while there have been efforts made to include vulnerable and disadvantaged Canadians in developing prosperity, the results, particularly during the pandemic, have not been particularly good. Racialized Canadians and other disadvantaged Canadians suffered disproportionately during the pandemic. How do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Childcare.
Sorry?
So, I'm not a racialized Canadian, but I am a woman, and my people do earn, 20 to 30% less than your people, Ed? So, I feel like childcare would be a really important way to make sure that, some of us who are on the margins, who are less equitably treated by society, could get a leg up. So that would be one thing. And I think I would say for Indigenous communities, what I've heard them say, and I don't want to speak for them, but what I've heard them say is they want a piece of the action economically, and my experience with that is that's really through resource development.
Okay, second question here is on populism. Is the rise of populism a huge factor in widening the polarity in society? So, how is populism playing into this difficulty forging consensus?
Populism is mainly negative now. There are some countries in which populism is much more positive. There have been periods in time when it's much more positive. It's now more about anger than it is about vision, about exclusion, than it is about proposal. So it alone, the phenomenon alone, is not going to be a solution. It well could be that the instinct that leads to populist movements could be encouraged to talk about real positive things. I agree absolutely about specific issues like childcare. I think I think people are tuning out. I think they don't believe the institutions are addressing the issues that are of interest to them. And I think that's going to be a major, and addressing that is going to be a major part of the challenge. Because we are fundamentally an optimistic country, and we have been in any event. And if we, and it has been one of our significant assets. But it isn't guaranteed. We're now becoming a more cantankerous country than we were. I want to step back, if I can, to the question of the contents of our population. For a long time, we called ourselves multicultural, and we were. But we didn't really recognize that multicultural meant there were going to be different perspectives on traditional issues. Different cultures yield that. And is that a threat? It needn't be. It can be a great richness. But it can only be a richness if we recognize that this is a reality, that that the attitudes of multicultural groups, the Asians are the most important in this regard, because for a long time, they caused no trouble. They were a part of our population, but people didn't really recognize them as that. And now they are emerging as victims. And they may, you know this better than I, they may also be emerging as people who feel themselves socially friendless. Who's going to come to their support? Well, I think we all agree that multiculturalism and immigration are great potential assets to us. But we sort of got them here, we plunked them down, we didn't think about what they mean, we didn't think about how we modify the way the rest of the country works. We have to open up our thinking. And I mean, again, I don't want this all to be praise of the report here, but the report indicates an opening of thinking and a willingness to look at other alternatives. The question is, what is a vehicle to carry discussion of those other alternatives towards some practical purposes? And one of the risks is that to this stage, they've depended in Canada upon the government of Canada saying, okay, go ahead and do it. It may be that there's an opportunity to turn that to the advantage of the Senate report now. But something like that has to be done. We're in a status quo that is gradually getting worse. The Canadian dream is gradually getting less attractive. And a lot of the authorities to which we turn are not responding in a way that attracts attention. On the contrary, people are staying away from the votes. from the elections, or are voting in exotic ways. So you've got something. The Senate has something to build on, but it's going to be a real question as to how practically that is done, and we'll all think about it. But I don't have an exact suggestion today.
I promised Robert Asselin I would go to him. So, Robert, are you out there in virtual land somewhere?
Hi there. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both for your thoughts and for your service to Canada. My question is really about strategy and ambition. Mr. Clark, you spoke a lot about the vehicle to get there. But my question is, it seems to me Canada has been successful because we did what was hard, and we had strategies to deal with our national unity, to deal with the United States, to deal with the world as a relative small population. And I think what is lacking, and this is more of a question than a comment, but I welcome your thoughts on it. What are you think the missing strategies and the missing ambitions going forward? What do we need to unite Canadians around undertakings that are ambitious, that will unite them around a cause? And it seems that what the Senate group has done here is very purposeful. It's around building long-term growth and resilience in the economy. So what are your thoughts about ambition, about strategies to get more ambitious, and about a sense of purpose and resolve and moonshots for Canadians?
Well, ambition has to be married to doability. There's lots of ambition and a lot of thoughts. The question is, how in a country like ours, structured as we are, do we actually get something like this moving? Again, I come back to the potential that is held by this report. It could be something around which that could be built. We're moving forward quietly on various points. There's more attention now to Indigenous rights. But there is no sense of movement about it. And you're really talking about what can be done that can cause some sense of common cause and purpose in the country. I think the Senate as a national institution can play a role in that. But because at the end of the day, that kind of leadership is not going to come from some town hall in British Columbia or in Alberta. It's going to come it's got to come from people with the authority to do something of that kind. And the Senate, has that kind of authority, has a kind of authority that is worth exercising. I wish I had a better answer than that. Because I remember a time when I was a student, when there were a lot of national conferences that were going on all the time that were highly productive. You'd go and you'd sit down and people would talk about what kind of futures were available to us. They weren't complaint, and neither were they simply narrow. They weren't simply advancing the interests of the sponsors. And that appears not to be the case now. So I wish I could be more help on this. I guess one answer is take what you have that might work, and there's a report before the Senate, and see what you can do with it.
You know, Senator, I would add to that, I would say I think Canada needs to reimagine itself as the most international country in the world. We are already one of the most multicultural places in the world, and we should be welcoming more immigrants into the country to build our economy. And building a society around that, around an open, free society around immigration. We should be working hard to form new trade agreements around the world so that we can reach out that way to other countries. We should strengthen our place at the United Nations and our place on the world stage so that we are, that we grow our respect. And we should be bringing people from around the world to strengthen our academic institutions so that we're producing the best thought in conversation with the best and the brightest from around the globe. Like, to me, that is the future of Canada. It is, as a truly international, multicultural country where people come from all over the world to make the best place on earth. And we reach out and we bring in order to do that. That, to me, is a great national project.
Well, I want to sum up for half a second what I think I've learned, and then thank you and turn it back to Senator Harder. You know, I hear about a kind of a decline. You both talked about decline, but it's a very gradual decline, and maybe it's a decline that's people distracted in their own filter bubbles and social media. Maybe it's a decline that they kind of feel and makes them frustrated, but they don't really feel invested enough in getting angry about it in some ways. I wonder about that. And, you know, Joe, you've referenced several times institutions of nation building, not just the official institutions, but people coming together in different institutions that probably are less vibrant today, and you know, fewer of those opportunities, and certainly a pandemic has made that even more so. And you know, at the beginning, when I asked you, was this fundamental or cyclical, I sort of think there are some fundamental. You know, Christy, you talked about the media, and the media not having the same capabilities and muscle tone that it once had. But there's another media system that exists next to it, and that media system perhaps divides people into tribes more than it unifies it. So I guess we really need to create counterbalances of institutions that are unifying out there and can get dialogue going again. I think that would be some of the message I take away from you. I don't know if that's fair.
Well, we've done it before. I mean, it's I'm always amazed. Even I was young at the time. But the then premiers...
Apparently when you were young, though, you went to national conferences on the future of Canada.
I did. But the then premiers of Ontario and Quebec, when the federal government was unwilling to address constitutional issues, convened the
Confederation
for Tomorrow Conference, John Robarts and Danielle Johnson. And they got every premier to come, including, I was astounded, your then premier, W.A.C. Bennett, and indeed mine, Ernest Manning. But they came, they were productive, they thought about things, they gave an example of this as a country, they chided the federal government into acting more quickly on initiatives for which the federal government naturally took the credit later on. But nonetheless, these things have happened in the country, and it may be that we're in a period of preoccupation before. It may be that leaders are not feeling their responsibility or their capacity. It may be that this is just a dip from which we'll rise. I wish I could be more confident about that. I agree absolutely that we have all the reasons for optimism in the world, indeed. And that's not just because the world is so bad. It is because we have so much capacity here. But we are not meeting it. And and we could gradually just drift into indifference. That's the risk of Canada. That's always been the risk of Canada. And what's interesting, the spirit we have to try to discover again, is how there has been a response to that might give us guidance now in these very different times as to what might be done.
Well, thank you both for those insights on the how, and thank you to the Senate, I guess, for the nudge and the vision that I think the Clarks are telling us we need.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Joe Clark, and thanks, Christy Clark. Much appreciated, and lots of food for thought. That brings us to the end of our program. I'm going to call on Senatress Ringette to bring it to an official conclusion on behalf of the Speaker.
So I feel like a bookend. I started and I'm ending. But what a conversation. Honorable Sénateur,
Honorable Senators, distinguished guests, we very much appreciate the conversation that was started today by all of you on the recommendations of our report, Forging a New Path for Sustainable, Inclusive and Shared Prosperity in Canada. Our group of 12 senators, the Senate Prosperity Action Group, would like to start by thanking the Speaker of the Senate, the Honorable George Furey, for allowing us to hold this first public discussion in the Senate chamber.
Our special thanks to Ed Griesbach and the Public Policy Forum for their unwavering support and partnership in co-hosting today's event. Our gratitude to Chief Bellegarde, should I say Chief Eaglefeather, and Elder Oaks for their precious opening of this forum. Yes, you will all agree with us for our gratitude to our eminent and dedicated Canadians for starting this needed national conversation in the person of the Right Honourable Joe Clark, the Honourable Christy Clark, former Deputy Premier Manley, Monique Leroux, France Donald, Tabitha Bull, and Chris Reagan from McGill. Thank you for your very wise comment and your commitment to our past, our present, and particularly our future. Honorable colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, during the last year, our Senate group met virtually with many experts and organizations within and outside our national border. We want to thank you again for entertaining our questions and your honest input that provoked our curiosity, our research, our deliberation, and our report. We did have rigorous discussions, but all our discussion, research, and meeting would not have been possible if not for Senator Peter Harder and his dedicated staff, Renee Allen, Brian Legge, and Mahmoud Nanji. Thank you so much for a fantastic job you did on behalf of our group. Now, Senator Harder, he initiated our group, and like the true and visionary leader he is, moved us forward, organizing virtual meeting with experts and organizations, focusing on the what and the how, researching relevant data, addressing our concerns, drafting an initial report and recommendation for our group input and consensus, getting a final report produced, identifying valued partners and panelists, including orchestrating today's event. I would also venture to say that he successfully managed to get 12 very opinionated senators from across the country and Senate groupings to the consensus report and recommendation discussed today. Quite an achievement to add to your already long list. Dear Senator Harder, on behalf of the 11 other senators, please accept our heartfelt gratitude for your patience and your unwavering leadership. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, our report demonstrates the current juncture of challenges and opportunities for our country to all Canadians. Your active and continuous participation in the discussions that we have started, whether it be around the kitchen table or the round table, in your businesses with clients and suppliers, with not-for-profit organizations and community, municipal, provincial, and federal representatives. In short, broader discussions will help us reach a consensus that will lead to results. We need to call upon our socioeconomic cohesion to lead our vast, beautiful country to a summit that is within our reach. Thank you to all of you.